But this bullet actually went through the left arm of my senior non-commissioned officer, Marlon Harper, severed his aorta, and then exited out of his chest. And the heat of the round actually fused to part of his armor plate, so when it ricocheted from him into my thigh, it was like this mangled piece of metal the size of a fist that just blew out my inner thigh femoral artery.
Wow.
Pretty much down to the bone.
Hey, it's Andy Petronic, and welcome back to the Andy Petronic podcast. This is episode number 148, and this is the place where it's my job to talk health, life, and well-being with the foremost leaders in the field, giving you the joy, knowledge, and inspiration you need to live your best life. Coming up today, I'm having a conversation with Josh Mantz. But a couple things first. It occurred to me, we're in the middle of the Whole Life Challenge, and it occurred to me that last night I had the opportunity to either hold fast and do a workout at 7 o'clock at night. Typically at 7 o'clock at night, I'm either making dinner or eating dinner, and it just so happened that my wife and my family was out. So I was at home alone, and I had the opportunity to choose. Do I work out, and do I get my workout in, or do I let it slide and wind down for the day? And I decided to run an experiment to see whether or not working out that late, because typically I don't work out at night because I'm afraid that it will affect my sleep. And so I decided to work out, and I did a 15-minute, pretty high-intensity workout, running and some power cleans with kettlebells. And you know what? I'm happy to report it did not affect my sleep. It didn't make me not able to go to sleep at a reasonable hour, like I think 9:45. And, I just want to encourage anybody out there, look, there's no wrong answer. When you're in the challenge and you want to hold yourself accountable and you want to be, accountable for getting in your workouts, great. Do it. But if push comes to shove and it's 7 o'clock at night and you've tried it before and you know that it affects your ability to go to sleep, perhaps it's not worth it. And I don't know that anybody has the quote-unquote right answer. I think the answer differs from person to person. And it may even differ from day to day, from person to person. I wish it was more clear-cut. I wish it was easier. I wish these answers about things that are for your health and well-being were cut and dry, but they're just not. So you're going to have to experiment for yourself. And I just want to encourage you guys to do that. Experiment. Be willing to try something new. If you've never gotten up first thing in the morning to go do a workout or go do a run at, I don't know, what if you normally get up at 6, get up at 5:40. Put your workout clothes on the side of the bed or right next to your door and roll out of bed, put on your workout clothes, go outside, walk for 2 minutes just to get your head cleared, and then do what you're going to do, whatever workout you're going to do. Try it. See what it's like. You got nothing to lose other than it not working. You have a rough day, but I think it's worth it. I wanted to remind you guys that if you need ideas for workouts, speaking of workouts, you can go to andypetronic.com/workouts. And there are 33 now, I think, maybe 34 and counting. And they're body weight workouts. They're all doable in under, I'd say on average, under 15 minutes. Some are like 10 minutes, 11 minutes. Some are 8 minutes. I think there are none that are shorter than 8 minutes. And they all are body weight. They require absolutely no equipment. You can do them in the confines of your living room or a hotel room or office or wherever you happen to be. And there are 30, like I said, a bunch of them you can choose from. I also put out a newsletter once a month on the first of every month, and it's full of like interesting tidbits of the things I'm exploring and discovering, and they're health related. Some are emotionally related. Some are, videos. Some are movies. most have links or some other place to go to read more and understand more, but they're very pithy, they're very actionable, and I get a lot of really good feedback from the people that subscribe. So if you're interested in getting those, go to andypetronik.com and subscribe. And I've got a few guests I want to tell you about coming up. Dr. Mark Goulston. It's so funny. I have so much trouble with his name. I actually had trouble with his name when he was here for the podcast. He's a psychiatrist. He's written 7 books. He's a fascinating man, and he's got this uncanny ability to help others that seem unhelpable. In fact, that's his mission, is to help people who are suicidal, who are, at the end of their rope, helping them kind of change the way they hear things and change the way they relate to others. I've also got Tracy Sundland. He was the original creator of the Rock and Roll Marathon. And that literally changed the framework, changed the foundation of marathons, period, in the 90s. And he's a fascinating guy. He's got a ton of experience and stories, so it's a really fun conversation with him. And then I've got Kevin Rose coming up. He's a noted tech investor, early adopter in lots of things, and he's also the creator of a couple apps that I like. I use one. Michael uses the other one. I use Oak, which is a meditation app, and Michael uses Zero, which is a fasting app. But we talk about that. We talk about Kevin's also very conscious of the choices he makes in his day-to-day life, and he shares a lot about how he makes those choices. He's done a lot of health hacking and health researching, and we talk a lot about that stuff. So those are 3 really fun guests that are coming up. But I want to get back to my guest today, because that's what today's all about. And my guest today is Josh Mantz. Now, you probably haven't heard his name before. He's a writer. He's an author. He wrote a book. But his big claim to fame, he's died. Yep. I'll just let that one sink in for a second. He has died and come back to life. 15 minutes he spent dead, without a trace of brain injury, without a trace of brain damage. He remembers every moment up to the moment that he died. And I mean, just that alone, that subject alone, we actually don't get to that until about halfway through the podcast. That subject. He was a soldier in Afghanistan. He was a platoon leader, and the events surrounding his injury, which was he was shot by a sniper, were pretty remarkable, and the experience itself. But a lot of his message now, he does a lot of speaking, and the subject of his book is really on influencing others around psychological trauma and adversity. We talk about transformation. We talk about his tattoo that says, "Thou need not swerve the bullet." He got that tattoo before he got shot. What? Thou need not swerve the bullet. 2 weeks before he got this shot that took his life, that was the tattoo he got. Crazy stuff. We talk about the poem Invictus. We talk about John Bradshaw and healing the shame that binds you, PTSD, hyper-arousal versus hypo-arousal. We talk about some of the things he thought about in his last minutes of life. We talk about the extreme peacefulness of death. There's a lot of really, really profoundly interesting, cool stuff in this podcast, and I really encourage you guys to listen. Whether you are interested in dying or not, and whether you are, you know someone, especially if you know someone that might be suffering with any sort of mental trauma or disorder, Josh has got a lot of experience and a lot of advice. Well, he shares a lot about what he's been through and it's been very helpful for people. So I'm not going to keep rambling. Let's bring him in. Josh Mantz, Let's go.
But how's everything going, man? It was great to meet you down in LA. I really had a good time down there.
It was it's great. I mean, it was so great to have you. Kenny's really done a great job of bringing in really powerful speakers for the Memorial Day Murph. And you just fit the bill, man. I don't know how Kenny's going to top himself next time. That's good.
That's good. Let me just dial it just a tad. I'm still like, I've had to learn all this stuff on my own, and it's
right.
I don't know. Is that cool?
Yeah, it's great. It's much better than before. The way before you looked like you had half a face.
Yeah, right. So I've got this. Hang on, maybe this will match the daylight a little better. Sorry, man.
It's all good.
That better?
Yeah, that's great. It's perfect.
All right.
Yeah, that's the best. That's great. Perfect. Love it.
We're getting there. I'm a rookie at this, but yeah, we're getting there.
So I don't know how Kenny's going to top what he's done, having you and he had a Navy SEAL speak. I don't know if you know Mark Devine, but Mark Mark Samos speak 2 years in a row. And he's been a pretty powerful speaker. So anyway, somebody's got big shoes to fill next year.
It was funny, man. I actually met Kenny at Mark Devine's Unbeatable Mind Summit.
Oh, right. That's right.
I was speaking down there. He was in the crowd. We connected. Awesome guy, man. Kenny, just incredible person. And but it was funny the way he prefaced this. He's like, Josh, I'm in a bind. I basically inadvertently have set a standard for these events.
Totally.
And,
yep.
And now I have to find good speakers to keep coming through. So, but it was a pleasure to be part of that, man. What a great team. And, you building the foundation for that. It was awesome.
Yeah, no, it was, I've also gotten a little smarter over the years, and I don't just automatically do Murph because it would put me in the hospital probably. Yeah. So this is the most I've scaled it, I think, ever. Doing a mile run, and then I did basically a quarter Murph, and then another mile run. But it just puts me in the hurt locker way too much, and it just doesn't I get it. I get you want to put yourself in that mindset, but to me, that doesn't serve anyone, really. I know I can do that. That's easy, actually. That's the easier route, which is strange for me, is to just push through, get through it. But I pay for it for, 2 or 3 weeks. Yep.
Kenny and I were actually talking about that a lot, is he's kind of looking to sort of change the dynamics a little bit of how he approaches that population down there. And man, like for me, I feel like right now I'm in the best shape of my life. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I'm also the most internally focused. I don't feel like I'm competing with anyone except myself.
Right.
And I don't feel like I'm doing that. I feel like I'm doing it in the right way. It's not about killing yourself every time, and that's counterproductive, and you get hurt. And I don't know. I've shifted for sure over the last couple of years, and kind of in this more for lifetime wellness and fitness, and just the mentality that it brings going with that.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I don't know when that flips for people, but I know it does. I don't think that's well, I shouldn't say that I know that it's universal, because I don't know that it's universal, but it certainly flipped for me. When I first started doing high intensity hard workouts, and even back when I was a Marine, and, there wasn't a thought that I was doing this for longevity or for health. I was just like, I'm doing this because I'm doing this, and this is awesome. I would run through the Navy SEAL confidence course, and I'd flip myself right over the top of the 50-foot cargo net at the top, not really thinking what might be the consequences of missing on the other side. Now it's like, Jesus, I think I'd be terrified to even just crawl over the top of that damn thing. So it's crazy how that shifts,
I was just having a conversation about this yesterday with, I I honestly, it was a guy that I ran into. We got in a conversation, and I realized, like, honestly, man, I didn't really learn how to squat the right way until probably like 4 years ago,
Right.
And I had to totally learn to reteach myself all those bad habits. And it wasn't like I was trying to have bad habits, but I remember the high school days of the football coach just pushing more weight, form's terrible.
Yep.
We didn't know any better.
Right.
And it's like, you really have to like check your ego at some point for longevity. And I basically had to start from scratch, perfect form, lightweight, higher reps.
Mm-hmm.
And you just dominate that. And you realize, I realized at least that doing that put me in far better condition, far better shape, and a far better mentality internally. When I kind of shut off the outside world and just really focused on the right way to do these things.
Well, I mean, that there's such a transference of that mindset and mentality to, other things in life. It's getting thrown off your game in a sport, or heck, you could even say in the military when you're out on a patrol, because of the way your enemy or the opposite team is acting, like focusing on what they're doing versus on what or your good operating procedures. Like the way the kids play baseball, focus on our game, not on what the other team's doing, on how many runs they're scoring, or even who they are. Doesn't matter who they are. We play our game.
Yep. Because if you don't, you're taking that mental energy, that emotional energy away from optimizing yourself, right? And it's like I used to always get into that trap of, I'd feel more tired working out with a group, because inadvertently I'd be like, feel like I'm comparing myself to the group or pushing myself too hard at the wrong moment.
Right.
I'm just sucking wind. And yet when we train ourselves to really optimize our own performance, and coming from that place, that doesn't mean negate everyone else. Use that as a perspective, as a guide, as a lens, right? But it's like, I don't know. It was a huge shift for me over the past couple of years.
That's cool. Well, I just like to say thank you for agreeing to do this and be here, and for everything that you're doing in the world. I was very touched and inspired. Well, I don't know if inspired. It's hard to. I've never heard anybody speak that has had an experience like you have. And I mean, it's inspiring in the sense that, gosh, I hope that I can survive for 15 minutes dead and then wake back up. But I can't really be inspired to do that, I can be inspired by what you're doing post that, and how you've set your life up to serve others. But yeah, it's just very moving hearing you speak.
I appreciate that, Andy. It's one of the things that's kind of evolved over the years is that it's not about the experiences that we endure per se, because the nature of those can be very, very different person to person. But the things that manifest from them emotionally, mentally, can be very similar. And where I really find beauty within the darkness, our most adverse experiences, is when we're able to internalize them, grow from them, and then ultimately be able to apply it to the lives of other people, so that they can garner something from it as well. Mm-hmm. And that's that's just where I find kind of the greatest value in the work that I'm doing now, and feel fortunate to do it.
How it wasn't always that way though. Like, how do you do that with the kind of experience you had? Like for anybody else out there that doesn't know, well, heck, I will have introduced you in the beginning of this podcast, so people will know if they've made it this far, what you went through. I read your book, by the way. I didn't quite finish, but I'm almost done. I got to the point where you had just gone in to see your therapist for the first time. And I think, what is it? It's a she, right? Vic? Is it Vic
Yep, her name was Vic Bruner.
Vic. Yeah, so that's where I am in the story. But what an amazing, interesting experience, because I was struck by the fact that you said you were spending, what did you say, 10 hours for every minute of your talk when you were doing the speaking when you first started? Like the amount of preparation you were doing to make sure that your talk was dialed in I'm like, oh my gosh, no wonder I'm not speaking yet. I don't want to do that.
Well, yeah, here's the thing, like with and there's a lot in what you just said right there. It's like when it comes to the reason that I continue to speak professionally is I look at it as every opportunity is really a strategic engagement, right? If you and I are talking one-on-one for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour, there's a good chance that I'll be able to convey a point. You'll be able to internalize it, through that dialectic back and forth. And that's great. But in the span of that 1 hour, we've impacted one person, right?
Right.
And when you're speaking, right, that could be 1,000 people in the crowd. It could be 5,000. It could be a couple hundred. It could be a gym full at CrossFit LA,
Right.
And the point is, like, in that same time span, you're able to influence the lives of many more people, just exponentially so. Mm-hmm. And as I everywhere that I go, everywhere that I travel, every audience that I speak with, I continue to get the sense that people in general are craving permission to be able to look at this topic of psychological trauma and adversity through a very different lens. And I kind of look at what I do as trying to give them permission to do that. Because it's still a topic that's widely stigmatized, widely misunderstood, yet it compromises and is infused with every facet of our lives to some degree for all of us.
Do you find that the way in for you, given your story, is, the hook? Because I'll just tell you, the hook for me was this guy survived being dead for 15 minutes. Right. Mm-hmm. That was an unbelievable, compelling. And I certainly want to get into that. But that makes you unquestionably qualified to talk about some pretty deep stuff. Right. But I think what you're talking about now has a way broader audience. Like, how many people are going to go through a near-death experience? I know we all want to be hopeful that there is something on the other side, and that there's, we all like that. But man, the stuff you're talking about now is the reach and the number of people that are suffering from trauma of various kinds. You can see it in the news reports last week that, when Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade both took their lives, they didn't go through half of what you've been through, but they did.
They did. What you just said right there is so critically important. And that actually, so the challenge with this story, right? Yes, the near-death experience is a very captivating thing for anyone. It's kind of a flashy, shiny object,
right?
Right. It's something that tends to fascinate people just because of the nature of it. The challenge with that, though, is that even in writing this book, right? I never wanted to write a book just about that.
Right.
Right. Could have, right? Certainly. But I wanted to be able to find a way to use that experience to impact the lives of others in some way. And the tricky part of doing that is for years, I got similar responses to what you just said right there. That after this talk, people would come up to me and start the conversation by saying, "Josh, I've never been through anything like what you've been through, but ... Yeah. And then they would finish their story. And I know that they were just trying to be humble. In most cases, I respect humility. I believe it's the greatest quality any of us can possess. However, when it comes to psychological trauma, we have a natural tendency to compare ourselves to other people, to other human beings. And if we do that in the lens of trauma and adversity, we inadvertently tend to minimize our own experiences by doing that.
Yeah.
And let's remember that trauma isn't always what it seems. The near-death experience seems to many like it might be the holy grail of trauma. Like, how could it get any worse than that?
Right.
But I'm also the guy that can tell you that was the least of it for me. For other people, maybe a different story, right? But trauma is very relative. For me, it doesn't discriminate. It was the experiences of losing my father when I was 7, the totality of deployment to Baghdad, relationship failures, divorce, financial distress, and being an entrepreneur, right? There are the things that we experience day in, day out, right, are as psychologically, emotionally, mentally as devastating as this near-death experience. And in fact, that was the easy part for me. A very positive experience in many different ways. But it doesn't seem like that on the surface. And that's where it gets tricky with this topic.
Is it positive only now in hindsight?
It was... That's a great question. When we talk about what I would call peak experiences, right? An experience that has the power to dislodge us from our past constructs of the world, right? And if we take a moment to define how I view trauma and adversity, it's a traumatic experience is a situation or event that fundamentally disrupts the way we believe the world should work, right? And when our perception of the world gets flipped upside down, it can compromise the way we feel about ourselves. Yep. Not just near-death experiences, right? But things like rites of passages, traumatic experiences or extreme adversity in general. We have powerful dream states that can invoke like a disruption in the way we think. Psychedelic states of certain kinds, when they're done right, can really like punch through that next bubble of consciousness and allow us, or open the door to transcend to a completely different perspective in the world. The problem is, it's not necessarily about the experience. It's about our ability to integrate the experience after it occurs, and learn what that means to us in the present day, right? Many of us have, and I struggled with that with this near-death experience. It was this profound thing that there was so much to it, yet I didn't know what to make of that. And as I kind of stumbled through this journey for 10 years afterwards, I found myself naturally falling into a trap that many of us do, which is trying to apply who I was before to the present day, right? It's like trying to fit the square in the round hole, And the real journey, the real process was learning what that meant to me in the present day, and ultimately learning to accept the death of my old self so I could fully live in the present moment. And by death, I don't mean that in the sense of like actual near-death experience, right? I mean it much more almost in a metaphysical sense, right?
Yep. How is the current Josh different than the old Josh? Like what is it that's different?
The biggest thing that I can point to is, many of us, especially your audience, your listeners, right? High performing audience, people who have a desire to make an impact to the world and influence the lives of others in whatever way that is. But when we push that too hard, when we go too long, there's a risk of losing who we are in that process. And for example, like work, and I don't want to call it just work, but even following our passions to some degree can become a very powerful form of an addiction. And for me personally, I again, not realizing this in the moment, but all of I discuss now, it is retrospective. But with all the best of intentions, I took this near-death experience, and 4 months later, I'm going back to Baghdad.
Right.
pulling off this impossible thing. I was pulling staples out of my leg with a Leatherman. I was pulling stuff out of my medical records,
Sounds like something I would probably have attempted too. I could very much relate to your story and wanting to be back to your men. Right? Yeah.
And I think many of us can in our own ways, right? There's that desire to be part of that team no matter what, And the problem is there is also some very deep-seated levels of guilt and shame that were starting to take hold that I wasn't even aware of. And what happened over the next couple of years, especially as I entered the speaking circuit, this thing really kicked off while I was an aide to a general officer in the Army, while I was doing multiple other jobs. And I kind of took on the added responsibility of sharing this story publicly less than 2 years after the injury. Mm-hmm. And that was like 200 talks in the span of a year and a half, 2 years. So the challenge with that is that, through that process, that story almost became a shield that I was hiding behind inadvertently. Mm-hmm. And, the much deeper aspects of myself were being lost. And that's where it turned dangerous for quite a while.
Pardon this interruption, but I want to remind you that one of the best ways you can affect your day is to not have to think about lunch or not even have to think about dinner. Why? Because you've got your meals, your lunches, your dinners, maybe even your breakfasts delivered to you right to your doorstep from the Good Kitchen. They would provide you with sustainably sourced organic food that is just delicious. Everything's pre-prepared, so there's no preparation. You may need to heat it up. I don't necessarily, but you may want to. And it just makes life simple. It eliminates the thinking, and it's been one of the greatest things I've ever done for myself. The meals get delivered once every 2 weeks in a box. Everything is recyclable in the box. And it sits in my fridge. They're vacuum sealed. They are a game changer. Seriously, people. So check it out. If you've never ordered from them before, get 15% off your first order. Just use the link thegoodkitchen.com/WLC. Thegoodkitchen.com/WLC. And that's it. Let's get back to the show. Was it mechanical? Was it almost a mechanical thing? Like, I'm going to be good at this, and here's, did that become kind of the way you approached it?
It was like many of us, right? It was done with all the best of intentions.
Yeah.
That this story had the capacity to impact the lives of other people. And I felt a powerful responsibility to do that. Because here I was coming back from this impossible near-death experience, dead for 15 minutes, no brain damage, no loss of limbs, full recovery. There was a lot about that didn't make sense, right?
Yeah, right.
And surely I felt that I had a responsibility to do something with that, And what happened is, over the next several years, I put so much emphasis on helping other people that I lost myself in the process. And the key difference, to get back to your original question of what's changed now, is there's a difference between doing things like that because we need to cover up some kind of internal void or suppress guilt or shame. What better way to suppress my own guilt than by making a profound difference in the lives of others, right? Right. And it's like, was I doing that because I needed to do it to suppress that void, to run away from myself? Or was I doing it because I truly wanted to do it? Right. Because it was really emanating from the right place. The former is destructive. The latter is sustainable, right? And that's been the biggest internal shift is uncovering the root cause of all of this psychological trauma, integrating it into my life, and now having the strength where I know that's emanating from a sustainable place for the right reasons.
How do you know when you're doing it, that you're doing it out of need rather than want in order to shift it? Like, do you have to go through some sort of breakdown in order for that shift to occur? Is that, do you think that's, I mean, I know that obviously that happened with you. Do you think that's required?
You know, I think there's there's a place that each individual needs to reach in order to face the truth. And that absolutely happened for me, not just once, but multiple times, of increasing severity over a couple year period, that really pushed me to maybe what spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle might consider a limit situation, right? A place where we truly feel like we have lost everything, complete fog, complete loss of sense of self and who we are. And it was through that fog that the truth finally started to emerge years later. After a lot of pain, I kind of joke around that the universe had to slap me around enough until I finally got the hint.
Yep.
And that hint ultimately came down to this word, surrender.
Wow.
You know, I think you may remember in the talk down in SoCal a couple weeks ago, I described that feeling of dying, that precise transition point from life to death, as a feeling of complete and absolute surrender to something much greater than ourselves. And through that was just an overwhelming sense of peace, you know, where everything, good and bad, just fell away and became part of everything and nothing at the same time. And what's interesting is that back then, 10 years ago, that experience was kind of forced upon me, right?
Yeah.
And what I've learned over the last 10 years is that the real beauty of life, the challenge of it, was actually reaching that point of surrender again, consciously, voluntarily.
Right.
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 And it's like, what does the word surrender really mean? You know, I struggled with that for a long time, especially people who are, you know, like us, that are wanting to drive change, and you know, does surrender mean just kick back, relax, and let happen what happens? Well, no, you know, and the best definition I got of this was actually speaking with Mark Divine, you know, of Unbeatable Mind, and we kind of got in this deep talk after a talk about this word surrender, and he turned to me and said, you know, Josh, surrender just means not being attached to the outcome.
Right.
You know, so ferociously and relentlessly pursue that which we believe in and that which we're passionate about. But do we have the strength to adjust and respond and remain resilient when the outcome isn't what we expected? You know, and that's kind of been the full circle true journey throughout this process.
Yeah, because life has a way of continuing to slap you around. I mean, whether you're attached to the outcome or not, life slaps you around.
Right.
But the more able you are to do that, I like that definition. That's a great definition. Because the more you're able to access your inner guidance, your values, your definition of your own success in your life, who are you, the more likely you are to be able to not capsize. I have this vision. I used to paddle outrigger canoes, and those are the canoes the Hawaiians use it's a canoe, 6-person canoe, and they've got these things called amas that go out to a stabilizer.
Okay.
And the akus are called the things, and then the ama is the stabilizer that keeps it from flipping over constantly in the ocean. But it can flip over, and you've got to be adept as a team of 6 people to keep the thing moving, use the forces of nature in your favor, and be attuned to making adjustments as you go, and not flip over. And the more novice boat you're in, and the more novice a steers person you have, the more likely it is that he makes the wrong move at the wrong time, and you guys make the wrong move at the wrong time, and the whole boat just goes hoolie. It's called hoolie. It's called hoolieing, which makes it very exciting and fun. but it certainly doesn't win you any races. So,
well, you bring up a great point with that analogy. It's because I don't know that I fully answered this, but you asked, well, how do you know when you're going through this if you haven't walked it before?
Yeah.
And the truth is I didn't know. Again, all of this was being done with pure intent.
Yeah.
I was walking towards the edge of a cliff and didn't know it. And there was, again, I can look back retrospectively, and there were people in my life, very few, but there were people in my life who were very close to me who did pick up on subtle warning signs, subtle indicators.
Yep.
They had the strength and the courage to approach me, to have a potentially uncomfortable conversation and kind of draw that behavior to my attention. I also had the courage to listen.
Right.
And it's a two-way street. And as we talk about the power of human connection, the relationships that we share between one another, there are some points in our lives where the people closest to us may know more about us than we know about ourselves.
Yeah.
In the moment. And even in those situations, if I didn't fully agree with what they were saying, or if I couldn't fully comprehend or internalize what they were saying, I still allowed myself to remain open to it, which was so important, because what that did, it sort of opened the door in my mind to allow a seed to be planted.
Yeah.
That would start to grow when the time counted. When I was in crisis, those were the things that I fell back on in the darkest moments that I couldn't erase,
Yeah.
And so it's like those backstops, the team of the boat, right? Like there's certain things that you need to learn on your own to really internalize it, yet relying on the power of the people around you for that perspective.
Yep.
Can be the thing that stops you or the entire group from capsizing, right?
Well, and I don't want to lose, one thing you said, which is, the importance of your willingness to listen, because I think that there's so many people in the world. The world is full of advice givers. Yep. The world, Facebook is full of advice givers. Instagram is full of advice givers. And I mean, I know this because I was one, and I still am to some point. I mean, if you're a coach or you're working with other people, they're asking for advice, so you're giving advice. But one of the things that I've learned over the years of doing this is I do my best. I don't always live up to this, but I do my best to offer my advice when someone wants to listen, and not not get hooked into my need to tell them what they need to do to be okay, in spite of them wanting to listen or not wanting to listen. And it can be very, very hard in the advice giving business to learn to hold back when there's just no listening, or you don't even know if there's listening or not. Like you said, you may not have been ready to take an action based on what you heard, but there was a seed planted. And I used to never take that into consideration when I was. If somebody didn't do what I said to do, I'd write them off. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to do it. F them. And, they're just not real willing to, walk through fire to get there. And that's not necessarily true. They might not have been ready in that moment, and they might need to do it their way. But, being willing to listen is a big part of that. It's a relationship that you have with the other person, and there's got to be two willing parties.
Yep. Man, that's a huge point. And it can be incredibly frustrating as a coach, as a mentor, as a parent.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, totally.
In a relationship with your spouse or your significant other, right? There are, it kind of comes down to this idea that transformation ultimately is an internal process. We have to be willing and ready to be able to take that initiative on our own. It's not a journey that we need to take alone, and that perspective and support we get from others can catalyze that so much more. Yet we cannot force people to transform.
Yep.
And as frustrating as that is, as say a coach, right, or a parent, right, it becomes even more severe and challenging if we're working with somebody who is dealing with a severe substance use problem or addiction, or are severely traumatized and can't seem like you can get through to them. Mm-hmm. Right? They can be incredibly devastating for the person trying to help, because you legitimately love them, you care about them, you want them to do well. You can see it clear as day. But in situations like that, sometimes the only thing you can do is try to set the conditions for that individual to reach out when they're ready. And that takes a great deal of patience. It takes faith. And kind of trusting in the core being of who they are, right?
Yep, absolutely, and can feel helpless, like it's a hard thing to watch,
Absolutely,
yeah, it's hard to watch. Hey, I want to shift gears a little bit. Your tattoo, "Thou need not swerve the bullet." It's unbelievable. Will you tell everybody about that? And I mean, can you roll? Is it on your arm? Where is that tattoo?
Yeah, it's here. Let me see if I can. I have to take my shirt off. Can't say I've done this on a podcast before. Let me see if I can show it. Yeah, this won't work with the. Well, whatever. I don't care.
Let's see it. Ladies, hide your eyes, or maybe not.
Only Andy can get me to strip during a podcast.
I love it. Do I need music?
Yeah, we should get some good music. But yeah, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a line there that says, "Thou need not swerve the bullet."
Jeez Louise.
Right?
Yeah.
And this, like, this whole thing here is it's a vulture, a spear, a trident, all symbols of Ares, the god of war.
Right.
So funny story behind this tattoo. First of all, that how this kind of all went down is I was in Baghdad, and 23 years old, leading an infantry platoon, and I wrote, there's so much to this, man, and it's literally the meaning of that has evolved for me over time, just as this story has. And one thing that I talk about in the first responder professions, military, police, people who are living in chronic states of adverse experiences or trauma. This could be a spouse who's being abused perpetually. This could be a kid that's living in an inner city, chronic trauma, continuous trauma.
Yeah.
When it comes to military and first responders, using them as an example, we, one of the challenges coming back from these environments is emotional numbness or emotional withdrawal. And that can leave us feeling very isolated, defective as human beings, that we can't access these emotions. We just feel dead, numb, that we can't enjoy anything. And the thing is, when we're in chronic states of trauma like that, we have to learn how to suppress emotion, not only to survive, but to thrive within those environments. And I'll tell you that I was at my tactical best when I was the most emotionally numb in that environment, right? I hated calling home to my family. I loved my family, but I couldn't handle the emotional fluctuation that it took to shift from combat to suddenly trying to turn on this other switch. I hated going to memorial services to honor our fallen. It wasn't that I didn't want to honor them. It's that I couldn't handle the emotional fluctuation as much. It's a hard thing to do. And the thought is that I'll turn those emotions on later. I'll honor our fallen later when I get back. And it's unfortunately just not that easy. It's a process to learn to re-engage with those things. The first indicator of this, which I can actually vividly remember, was a point in Baghdad when we were driving down a road that was known to be a very high threat of roadside bombs and improvised explosive devices. And we would get hit with these bombs on a daily basis. I was exposed to one blast. I was in an armored vehicle that weighed about 15 or 20 tons.
Like a Bradley?
Yep, a Bradley. and a little cinder block sized roadside bomb through that vehicle clean off the road, wow. like it was a tin can. And it was just the most horrendous explosions, right? So these things are everywhere. The problem is you can't see them, right? They're buried in trash, or, and you either have to do one of two things. Sometimes you just sort of have to take the risk and keep going, knowing that there's a threat there, or I could, cower back on my base and not go out into the sector at all, and just continuously get stalled out because of the threat. So when we're in a perpetual threatening environment like that, we kind of just learn to suppress that fear and just sort of be like, let's go, And I remember this one time we were driving down the road and my lead vehicle says, stop. He calls over the radio, stop. And, I look around and sure enough, to my right was every indication of an improvised explosive device sitting right to my right. And had that thing blown up, every one of us would have been killed instantly, vaporized. Wow. And I remember in that moment, there was no way out of the situation. I just remember looking at it and staring it down and daring it to blow up, right? Blow up, go ahead, right?
Yeah.
And it was in that moment where you kind of almost accept death and you feel larger than life. And there's almost a freedom in that, right? In the moment. And it kind of, though, leaving off of that almost complete fearlessness, I went home a couple weeks later for leave, and that's when I had this tattoo placed on my arm, like this idea of "Thou need not swerve the bullet, bring it." Right.
Right.
It was from a poem of someone trapped on the Bataan Peninsula, POW, in the Bataan Death March. So it carried a very special meaning to me. The interesting thing is that, like 2 months later, I get back, right, and was patrolling, and that's when we got shot.
Yeah, right.
Right.
That's what's so unbelievable to me about it. I mean,
so it's like the moral of the story is don't tempt the war gods.
Yeah, right. Who's the war god? Is it Mars or who's the
Mars? Ares. Mars
Ares,
is like
right.
the Roman equivalent.
Right.
But yeah, it was bizarre because not 2 months after I got that tattoo, I was got hit by that bullet, and the thing is, though, like I didn't die from it. I came back, and it's more like the meaning of that has changed for me, and
yeah.
Thou need not swerve the bullet. It's not necessarily a bravado thing like bring it, right? But it's an acceptance of what life can throw at us, and our ability to respond to it, to integrate it, and most importantly, to derive meaning in those experiences, using them to our advantage.
Hey, good people. I am here to remind you that this podcast is only capable of growing based on your word of mouth. I mean, I talk about it, but it's a little different when the host of the show talks about it than when somebody that loves the show talks about it. I can put it up in my Instagram feed, but that's an ad. I mean, people are looking at you like, well, of course you're posting a little post about your podcast. You're supposed to. Yeah, what? You don't like your own podcast? Of course you're going to do that. Well, it means so much more when one of you writes something about it, posts something about it, sends an episode to a friend because they think something in it is valuable enough to do that for, or leaves a review in iTunes. The way to do that is to use this link, bit.ly/Andy Petronic podcast. It will open up the podcast in iTunes. You'll be able to leave a review. And that's that. So if you're so inclined, it would behoove me, behoove the podcast, behoove our guests, behoove the world, because these stories get out to more people, to say something about it. Say something on social media. And do us the favor. Do us all the favor. And yeah, thanks. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, it's a little like the words of... is it Rudyard Kipling's? There's another poem. God, there's a CrossFit named Invictus. A little like I'm the captain of my ship. I'm the something about my fate and my soul. Like a willingness to accept my fate and a courage to keep going no matter what my fate happens to be.
Precisely. It's life hits all of us, right?
Right.
And there's maybe the biggest thing that I've learned throughout this entire journey is that healing is a journey. It's never a fixed point in time. And transformation is a journey. It's never a fixed point in time. And that the courage it takes to go within, to understand ourselves, to emanate from that place first. It takes more courage to do that than it does to set foot on any battlefield. And similarly, it takes courage to surrender to this process of life, like knowing that we don't necessarily know how we're going to respond to the events of tomorrow when they occur. We can do our very best to prepare for that, to adapt to it when it occurs. But when I started getting overconfident and thinking that I had this thing licked, that I had my emotional past defeated, that's when it came back to bite me the most, you know? And just briefly, what I mean by that is there's a point in the book where I think you just got through it, where you're about to get to it, where I left this assignment at Fort Riley, Kansas. Just speaking circuit was at its peak. I was in command. I ran myself into the ground and almost died again because of it. And I walked out of that assignment 30 pounds lighter, a career-ending surgery from Crohn's disease because I wasn't taking care of myself, and a divorce, Wow. And it's like I was just broken leaving that place. And I kind of put that stuff behind me. I moved to California. Things were sort of revamping, and I kind of fell into this trap of believing that I got this. I started feeling better. I transitioned out of the military, started working for Tesla. I was kind of on cloud nine, just out here in the private sector. Things were good. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that shield of my story that I was hiding behind before, this near-death experience or whatever that was, that shield, that necessity to be able to make an impact in the lives of others transitioned into relationships, unhealthy relationships, where I found myself gravitating towards women who oftentimes had extremely traumatic pasts of their own. I kind of became this rescuer, this savior, again, with all the best of intentions, but totally blowing off what the truth was within me without even knowing that. And the bottom line is, I describe guilt and shame as a form of cancer. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, we're at stage 1, and it kind of infects the deepest, darkest corners of our soul without us even knowing it, yet subtly starts to control our lives in ways we don't even understand. And before long, we're at stage 4 and in crisis, and that's almost precisely what happened. The shame and guilt kind of went into a remission. I believed I had it licked, right? But it just found a different way to exploit, a different way to express. That turned into alcohol and unhealthy relationships, and certainly a couple more big crashing points again before I finally got the hint. How did that happen? I about 2 years ago, went through a massive relationship failure that just was very sudden, very abrupt. I was all in, and it just rocked me back to that point I was describing when we mentioned Eckhart Tolle and the limit situation, the complete fog, right? And that moment, as much as I tried to participate in a true healing process for that 10 years, right? It's like that point in time, that true rock bottom fog, which was worse than anything I experienced before. That was the first time that I truly got honest with myself. And I had to ask a couple questions. I had to start asking the questions like, why are my reactions to these relationship failures so severe? Why am I spiraling so deeply into this abyss, right? and I knew how dangerous it was. And I started referring to this book that I read by a guy named John Bradshaw.
Oh, yeah. I know John Bradshaw.
Psychologist, right?
Yep.
So he wrote a book called Healing the Shame That Binds You.
I've read it. Yep. Absolutely.
Amazing book, right?
Amazing book, yeah.
So there's a quote in there that he says, to a shame-based person, which means to a person carrying unresolved shame from whatever the source in their past. But to a shame-based person, abandonment in relationships is akin to death. We have rejected ourselves, and when the people closest to us abandon us, it reinforces the fact that we're worth less than other human beings, right? And in these moments, in these rock bottom moments, I had to finally ask, if we take Bradshaw's words to be true, then that would mean that I'm carrying unresolved shame from something, because this sure feels like it's akin to death.
Right, totally. Yep.
And at that point, that's where the truth really started to emerge, right? And I really started to uncover the truth behind trauma.
Did you have to go back to earlier stretches in life from childhood stuff? Like, how did you get there, and where did it end up? What were some of the corners it was lurking around? Is that okay to ask? I don't know what you're okay sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is what I talk about. I mean, we get this out in the public for, conversations like this in order to kind of allow people to look at it maybe through a different lens.
Yeah, right.
In their own life. And what's interesting is the whole time on the speaking circuit, right? I mean, man, I was interacting with the best behavioral clinicians out there. I was briefing at behavioral health conferences. I had like a clinical understanding of this topic of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
Right? Yet I still failed to recognize the symptoms within myself.
Well, you know what I thought was really interesting in your book was you said that you didn't really have any of the traditional symptoms. You didn't, like, all the symptoms that you knew were on paper, ... were not showing up for you. So I can't remember what you said now after reading that section of the book. There's more to it than that. But what was that? What am I missing?
So what traditionally has, what I kind of call this, it's more of a stigmatized view of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? PTSD, which I don't even like using that term. Anyway, when we look at things like people in the post-trauma state, there's a couple ways that we can respond. The thing that we tend to think of culturally, how it's been portrayed in the media, XYZ, the stigma around it, right, is what's called hyperarousal symptoms. Being in hyper states of anxiety, nightmares, night sweats, panic attacks. Being jumpy at loud noises, being triggered by large crowds, etc. Right?
Yep.
These are things that are absolutely valid, right? That many people can experience in the post-trauma state, and I'm not negating them, right?
Yep.
But what I am saying is, one, I've never experienced any of those, and yet I was still falling into these deep suicidal spirals, this emotional numbness. And many of the people who I've worked with over the years, like, I continue to see this as kind of the suppressed side of trauma. A lot of people don't experience hyperarousal symptoms. Mm-hmm. What they do experience is much harder to quantify. It's much harder to see on the surface, but it's what's called the hypoarousal symptoms. Mm-hmm. It's the emotional withdrawal. It's the numbness. It's the depression. It's the social isolation. Which can be just as deadly and devastating, especially since they kind of hide in the shadows and they're much less discussed, right? So it's really a spectrum that we could experience as we start to overcome adversity. Hyperarousal symptoms, right, which can be kind of sometimes more obvious to see on the surface, to point to. The hypoarousal symptoms, much more difficult to see and express in words.
Yeah, right.
And that's kind of where I place my focus today.
Yeah, I relate to that. The very first life coach I used to work with used to call it going dark. Because I used to go dark and, just disconnecting from the world, disconnecting from especially the people that mean the most, right. One word answers. My relationships used to, that would be a continuous source of challenge in my relationships was, them doing everything they could to engage with me, and I was unengageable. Right. Like on one hand, I would love the attention I was getting from that significant other. It was obvious that they loved me, that they cared for me, that they, and I wanted that. And on the other hand, I was like, leave me alone. Get the hell away from me, And that was, going dark was what she called that.
Yeah. It's a great example. As I kind of look back on this and what really allowed me to uncover the truth behind all of this, honestly, was going through the process of writing this book was huge. As I approached this book, it's again, I want to do it with a good intent to try to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And I kind of describe it as if I was to write a book on business and screw it up, somebody might make a bad business decision, right?
Sure, right.
If I'm writing a book on emotional trauma, psychological trauma, and screw it up, it could be damaging to people.
Sure, right.
So I had to, I found myself in a position where I'd be pacing around my house for hours, days, an entire weekend to kick out a paragraph of this thing.
Wow.
I'm thinking about like, how's a rape survivor gonna take this? How's a school teacher gonna take this? Just in the most humble and approachable way possible. Was I didn't want to minimize anyone's experience or lead people down a wrong path. And doing that not only required me to like deeply process the stuff, but to go even much deeper and to be able to convey it in a way that others could potentially benefit from it as well.
Yep.
And in that like 3-year process of writing this book and the final product, it's here now. That was one of the most transformational things in my life. Wow. All of it is directly translatable to what I do on stage now, like the speaking ability, the talks, the things I discuss. Like in the end, it's like what we were talking about before we went live here with you. We were talking about CrossFit and working out and going internal, right? Same thing with life in general, right? That parallel is there. Where I became the most effective in what I do was when I had the courage to go within first.
Yeah, right.
To build up my core, right, and to emanate from that position first. Which is there can be a fine line between the desire to serve and sacrifice for others, but if I'm neglecting to do that self-leadership, right? If I'm neglecting to lead myself, it's going to compromise my ability to impact others.
Yep. I've got a what might sound like a childish, boyish, silly question. You said that the bullet, it's one of those things that, when somebody's in the room that has lost an arm or lost a leg or has a disfigurement or something, and nobody in the room is addressing that thing, and then a kid walks up to him, is 5 years old, hey, what's wrong with your leg? Or where'd your leg go? Or where'd your, what happened to your nose? It's the question everybody wants to know the answer to. Now, I'm not saying that this question that I had is the one everybody wants to ask, but because if you haven't read your book, you wouldn't even have thought to ask this. But I like to ask those questions. What you said, the bullet that hit you, and was he your platoon sergeant or he was not? Because you had another sergeant that took over for both of you guys. Yep. What was he? Is Marlon, right?
Yep. So Marlon Harper, he was a staff sergeant, and he was considered to be the senior scout. It is a scout platoon. Senior scout of the platoon. So he was basically the second highest non-commissioned officer in that platoon. Okay. The nature of that deployment mandated that we basically split our platoon in half so we could be out in the environment 24/7. Right. And so a lot of the work that I did was paired with Marlon on the non-commissioned officer side, and Sergeant First Class Eric Smith, the platoon sergeant, typically ran the night patrols.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. You said that the bullet that hit you guys was the size of a fist.
So it was what happened. It was an anti-aircraft weapon.
Jeez, like a 50 cal, like that kind of a bullet, or was it?
Yep. And what happened is we to our knowledge, we had never seen a weapon of that caliber used as a sniper rifle on dismounted troops before in this war, at least in Iraq.
Because you can't. Because tell people, a 50 cal, you can't just carry it around. That size of a weapon is like, I don't know how much it weighs, but it's too much to just hoof around. You're pretty stationary when you've got something like that. Yep.
They had all kinds of different, very innovative ways to engage us that would kind of blow your mind. But bottom line is, this was done by a very professional team. Yeah. We're very confident in that. Highly trained. It was a complex ambush. But this bullet actually went through the left arm of my senior non-commissioned officer, Marlon Harper. Severed his aorta and then exited out of his chest, and the heat of the round actually fused to part of his armor plate, so when it ricocheted from him into my thigh, it was like this mangled piece of metal the size of a fist that just blew out my inner thigh femoral artery.
Wow.
Pretty much down to the bone. If that bullet would have hit me first, there'd be no prayer.
Yeah.
And kind of as the case in Marlon, he was killed almost instantly.
Right. Right.
But yeah, that's what it was. It was, and even another piece of that round took, broke off and hit one of my interpreters.
Really?
A minor wound. Yeah. So it was a devastating single shot.
Wow. Yeah, I've never heard of such a thing. I've never heard of it was really fat. I'm like, God, that must be a misprint. And I'm like, then I thought, no, there are no misprints in this book. That is no way. Not details like that,
It was pretty wild, man. The thing is, though, it's like the biggest honor in this whole thing for me was, it was about probably roughly 30 minutes between the point I was hit and the point I took my last breath in the aid station, right? And I remained conscious through that entire process and was able to witness everything. And it was just phenomenal to watch a highly trained team perform in the face of crisis just perfectly, and to see all that skill, all that training come to work in a situation like this it was humbling, and it was the day where I really, truly learned what it meant to be part of a team, to be part of the Army, and kind of just the spirit of human beings and what they're capable of in situations like this. It was phenomenal.
Were you concerned after you were hit, or was anyone else around you concerned that there was a bigger ambush planned and there were more people in jeopardy? Is that something that actually could you formulate those kinds of thoughts when that was happening?
Well, that's always a threat. I was, in fact, that actually happened. We didn't know until afterwards, but we were kind of pulled into a very complex ambush.
Yep.
And they actually had mortar rounds dialed in on the aid station as well, which I didn't even hear going off, but. Mm-hmm. Yeah, apparently when I was actually in that aid station, the medics were doing their work under fire from mortar fire.
Wow.
Right? So, because they knew that's where they'd evacuate us to,
yep.
Right?
Yep.
So, yeah, there's always secondary, tertiary effects. You're always thinking as far ahead as you possibly can. Sometimes that's minutes, hours, years, whatever it is, but you're always kind of thinking of the potentiality of what could happen.
Were you immediately concerned for your life when that occurred? Were
Not
you?
Not at all. I didn't even know. There's so it's amazing how the body responds in situations like this to survive. And I went through a progression of different phases, like over that 30-minute period as I was dying. And initially, I didn't even know that I was shot. Right. It was, and throughout this whole thing, there was no physical pain at all.
That doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, like, I can't even really fathom how that's possible. You're missing a chunk of your leg, right? Like the size of a softball. Well, yeah,
and the body is geared towards survival.
Yeah,
it's geared towards.
I mean, logically, it makes sense. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I can definitely hear you say that and go, yeah, I guess so, right? The body, but it doesn't make any sense still.
It's wild, man. Like the body in a catastrophic injury, the body will shut down everything that it doesn't need in order to survive, right? And in this case, like that was a physical pain.
Right.
No physical pain. Later on, I felt the only kind of pain I experienced was an anaerobic pain. Because when you're dying of blood loss, you're essentially suffocating.
Right.
So it felt like I was doing, pick your hardest CrossFit workout and imagine you're doing that, but just unable to stop, right, at all. And that's kind of what it felt like, pure anaerobic pain. But in the beginning, I didn't even know that. It sort of, when that bullet first hit me, things went into slow motion. They transitioned, at first it kind of, the impact of that round felt like I was being picked up by the swell of an ocean wave. If you're just sort of standing in the surf and a wave slowly comes in, that's what it felt like slow motion.
It's like a scene out of The Matrix or something, like.
Yeah, it kind of was. Yeah. That's what it felt like. Yeah, I like that. That's a good description. And then like, that slow motion, I looked with like crystal clarity into Marlon's eyes and just saw him slowly fall to the ground, right? And then just instinctually, I drug him to safety. So, I mean, here you got, like you said, I had a blown out femoral, didn't know it, and was fortunate to not like hesitate and just immediate reaction was to help him, right? Started to strip his gear off, but that slow motion time transitioned to this sense of fast motion time, right? Where here's a 250-pound guy, blown out femoral artery in me, and he just felt like a feather, had his gear off just instantly. It felt like, you're dealing with all these straps and buckles, and it usually takes gear off, right? It was just like boom, boom, boom.
Especially when it's somebody else's. Like your own is actually a lot easier than somebody else's because you've done it over and over again. But somebody else's gear, you don't know where the straps are. You don't know where they buckled it. It's much harder. That's why a lot of times people will revert to knives or whatever to cut gear off because it's so hard to unstrap it.
Exactly. But what happened is it's I mean, this is about as dark humor as you can get, I guess. But I rip his gear off and see clearly that his aorta is severed, and while I was dragging him, I was calling up on the radio to our medic, we have 2 casualties. And I said that twice. And the second time I could barely say it because I was like already getting out of breath. Yeah. And I realized that something was wrong. I didn't know how badly I was injured, but something was wrong. And I remember when the medic got to me, he grabbed me and he said, "Sir, who's the second casualty?" And I said, "I am." And I
so you inherently knew, but you were just impervious to the pain and you weren't going to let that stop you.
Yeah.
I guess. Wow.
It's but it's almost like with the medic's arrival, there was a sense of safety with that.
Yes.
That I could kind of pass the situation off to him.
Yep.
And it's almost like at that point my body collapsed, and I went into this. The only way I can describe it is like almost a sense of subconsciousness for a minute. Like that scene in the end of Gladiator when his body's sort of floating above the flowers and he's sort of in this surreal state as he's about to die. That's almost what it felt like. Like I was like drifting into this deeper and deeper sleep. I just wanted to do nothing more than to let go. No pain, no nothing. I was falling into sleep, and my men started to drag me, right? So I was moving. I still remember how it sounded grinding against the ground.
Wow.
But again, I felt safety. I was feeling like there's nothing more I can do. It's okay, let go. And what snapped me out of that is I heard one of my guys just yell to me at the top of his lungs, "Come on, sir, stay awake." Huh. Right? Yeah. And even in that state that I was in, I could hear the emotional pain in his voice. And I realized in that instant that like, I'm still in the game. I still have a breath. I have to do everything that I possibly can to help them help me, right? And to lead them through this situation, as broken as I was. Like, I was still their leader, right? And it's like the power of that moment, like, literally woke me back up and caused me to fight the rest of the way. Man, it's just so powerful what that camaraderie, that tribe mentality can do in those situations. I realized in that moment that the injury wasn't about me. It was about the team. It was about the families. It was about everyone. Yeah. So that's what you're fighting for in that moment, which is pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I just get the word service, serving others, as it was probably, look, I never went through anything remotely close to what you went through. But when I got out of the Marines, the only thing that was really, really, really hard for me was leaving the people, the connections, and the camaraderie, and the friendships and leadership. My superiors and the people that I led. That was really, really, really hard. And it's interesting, your experience of service in the moment that you're dying as more important than even your own life.
It's man, there's some wild moments embedded in that. I mean, to kind of share one of the more funny ones with you. So when I was in the aid station, right, they were stripping my gear off.
Is the aid station kind of like a MASH unit, like the old show MASH?
Yeah, to clarify that, this was I was evacuated to one. If I was in Afghanistan, I probably wouldn't have made it, right? Because we most likely would have been too remote, and we were just very lucky to be only about a 10-minute drive from the closest aid station. Which was, so it's like a MASH unit. It was called a level 2 care facility. Mm-hmm. So they just had very rudimentary basic equipment there, but a dynamite trauma team, trauma unit, right? And, to just put this into perspective, the defibrillator paddles that they used to shock me back to life came into the base that very morning.
That's incredible.
And they had to take them out of the plastic to use them on. The guy that was doing CPR on me for a full 15 minutes straight just happened to be a former football lineman who weighed about 260, and 6'6", huge guy, right?
Right.
The nature of that thing, I was basically evacuated laying on a cot, right? And they couldn't. Nobody else could reach to get the proper leverage to do CPR, so he had to actually stand on an MRE box, a box. Here's
Holy
this 6'6"
cow.
guy. Just if anyone's ever done CPR live or on a like, even the people in best shape are going to be exhausted after about 3 minutes, right?
Yep.
And he went for a full 15, just pouring sweat, never stopped, right?
Wow.
And I mean, it's just like situations like that over and over and over again that happened. But I mean, one of the things in there, so this is where it gets really bizarre is as right before I got to the aid station, I was, in a Bradley fighting vehicle, a transport vehicle. The medic rode with me and cinched up a tourniquet, and he was just trying to keep me conscious, and I was trying to stay conscious. And that's where the real fight for my life began. That's where this anaerobic pain set in. It felt like I had given blood 20 times over, and just barely staying conscious. But my goal was to make it to that trauma team, and did. But as I'm on the table, it just started to change pretty dramatically. And as I mentioned, the body will actually try to pull the remaining blood it has to the chest cavity.
Yep.
To protect its vital organs. And I could literally feel the blood creeping out of my extremities, gravitating towards the chest cavity. And as that happened, it became harder and harder to breathe. But a little story embedded in this is that not many people know, so I'll share it with you guys.
Cool.
But I had a big wad of Copenhagen chewing tobacco in my mouth when I got shot, right? And didn't think to spit it out. It wasn't the first thing on my mind. And I remember in the transport vehicle, my medic, who was only 19 years old, just cinched up this tourniquet, and suddenly I feel this finger come into my mouth. He sweeps away the Copenhagen, throws it to the side, and just keeps going like nothing happened, because clearly it posed a choking hazard.
Yeah, right.
And in that moment, I just remember thinking, wow, here's this 19-year-old kid in the middle of a catastrophe, and he still remembered to do his secondary checks.
Yeah, right.
And in that moment, I stopped thinking about dying. It all fell away, and I just felt like I was incredible in just such incredible hands, and just so proud of him, of the whole situation, even in that moment. What happened a little later in the aid station is I was literally probably like 2 or 3 minutes away from death. There was still a little piece of Copenhagen trapped in my mouth, and it was bothering me so much because I was just horribly thirsty. Like can't even describe the level of thirst this was. And there was this female soldier at basically positioned over my head who was placing the oxygen mask on me. Mm-hmm. And like the Copenhagen made it harder to breathe, and I was trying to spit it out, but I didn't want to spit on her. Mm-hmm. Right?
You're still thinking about it's amazing you're thinking about that.
Literally.
That just is bizarre.
This is like we're like 3 minutes from death here. Yeah. This is what I'm thinking about, man. And it's like I remember like swatting the mask away a couple times because I felt like it made it harder to breathe.
Yeah.
And I noticed this pattern that whenever I slapped it away, there'd be like a timing about it, and she'd put it back on. And I was like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to slap it away, and I'm going to time it so then when the mask comes back on, I'll spit the Copenhagen into the mask so it doesn't go on her. Right? So I swat it away. The mask starts to come in. She sees me starting to spit, and I spit, and it almost hits her in the face. And as much as I could, man, I tried to say I'm sorry, but I couldn't even speak the words.
Yeah, right.
It was like literally like 2 minutes later I was gone.
Wow.
But it's just kind of ridiculous. What'd you think?
Well, Josh, so like 2 minutes later, you went. And I think it'd be crazy for me to have you as a guest on the podcast and not to ask you about the one question that probably everybody wants to know is what's on the other side. You died. You did something that almost no one gets to do and live. What was that? What was that like for you?
I'll start by saying that I did not have any type of out-of-body experience in the traditional sense that we think about it, like floating above my body. I didn't see a white light. In that transition, things really just faded to black, right? But what I did experience, I think, was even more profound because I know I was conscious for it. And what I'm referring to here is really the progression over the last minute. And two things happened, right? The first thing that happened is it's not as if life flashed before my eyes. This is a point, this last minute, where I realized the injury was getting out of control, where I realized I was a couple breaths away. And in that moment, life didn't flash before my eyes, but I do believe what was most important to me was revealed in those final moments. And instinctively, I started to repeat 3 names in my mind over and over and over again, and that was my mom and my 2 sisters, rapidly, right up until the end. But in the end, and I mean the last breath, the precise transition from life to death, that moment, is again, I can only describe that as a feeling of absolute surrender to something much greater than ourselves. And through that, what was this incredible sense of peace, like every good, every bad, every positive, every negative, every doubt, every hope, everything just fell away. And it's almost as if the spirit became part of everything and nothing at the same time. This is something people of Eastern religious traditions may call an absolute pure moment of awareness. Some of us might call it the absolute pure love of God. It's a feeling that I can barely even do justice to trying to describe it. And ironically, it's something that has since then brought peace to, or helped bring peace to a lot of other people, sometimes on their deathbeds. My own grandfather was an example of that. We kind of told him this. He was refusing to let go. He was in hospice. He was in extreme pain. And I told my mom this for the first time a couple years ago in this moment, what that felt like. And I said, Mom, if you think this is appropriate, tell him this, right? And that night she whispered it in his ear, and he died 10 minutes later, peacefully, And it's like, I, for whatever reason, I've been getting this weird question just over the last month that I've never gotten before from audiences. And that question is, do you fear anything?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
that question definitely crossed my mind.
Really? Yeah. It's almost like I stumbled to answer that question. I ironically never got it before. What's interesting about it is that if I fear anything, right, it's not necessarily death. It's the loss of the thing that I believe is most important in life is the relationships with one another. Love, right? And if the only fear for me associated with death is like the loss of that love, like what's going to happen, right? And it's almost like the farther that I get from my own experience in that own moment, I've actually had to start reminding myself what that felt like in that final moment, that feeling that everything falls away, that it's more grand and complex than we could ever possibly describe. And whatever's racing around in our minds right now, whatever we fear right now, all of it falls away. All of it is okay, right, in that final moment, right? And it's just it's a profound thought, right? To be able to, because we kind of tend to think or naturally assume that this peaceful feeling in the end just means all the bad is taken away. Yep. Right. Yeah. And what I'm saying here is actually much bigger than that. That all we perceive as good is also taken away. And it's just this absolute pureness of spirit, of life, of whatever we choose to define that as.
Well, judgment goes away. There's no, because good and bad is really just our own thinking, right? I mean, you say one thing's good, and I say no, that's not so good, that's bad, and somebody else says no, that's good, and somebody else is like no, that's medium. Like that's just our own fabrication, our own mental picture of life. So, it makes sense to me that goes away. Yeah, logically, again, this is one of those logical things I can understand, but I really can't understand fully.
Yeah, it's hard to it's really difficult to place it into words. It's hard to conceptualize.
Yeah,
but it is kind of the gift of this entire experience that ironically has even started to help me. Lately, as because to remind myself of that is a really important thing to be able to do. So of course I fear things. I'd be concerned if I didn't.
Yeah, right. You wouldn't be alive. I mean, really. No, isn't it it's probably a human condition, but it's funny that we think that. We wonder, because I would have the same question for a guy like Laird Hamilton, or I don't know if you know who he is. He's a big wave surfer, or some of the guys that go do, put their life on the line. I think courage is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to take action in spite of the fear. And I don't see fear going away,
right.
Anytime soon. And I'm no expert, but you're kind of confirming that, it's not gone.
I'm totally, yep. And it's like not just fear, it's the spectrum of emotion that we experience.
Yep.
Happy, sad, glad, mad, right? All this stuff. We kind of have these perceptions of running away from one and trying to gravitate towards the other. And kind of what I've learned or what I feel is that our degree of plasticity in order to operate within the range of emotions is kind of a sign of emotional health.
Yeah.
Right. Like our ability to operate within a larger emotional bandwidth, and then return to the center of gravity is what really propels us to experience and value life, because all emotions are there for a reason. All have value. Right. And it's, that's the challenge, and that's the interest, that's the journey in learning able to re-access those emotions, right, and harness them. Yeah. Difficult thing to do when you're not used to doing it, right? It takes a lot of introspection, a lot of really getting in touch with yourself. It's a continuous journey, and it can be scary in itself. But it's one that is it leads to this different level of wisdom and maturity, that can broaden the perspective of life as a whole.
Josh, so if you fast forward to today, how do you keep yourself your best? How do you, you've integrated a lot of things. Obviously it's still a journey. You're still on the journey, but do you have a morning routine you follow? Do you have a evening thing or a daily practice, or what are the things that are really important to keeping yourself able to continue to serve like you are?
Yep. It's so important to be able to control the things that we can control, right? And to kind of take ownership of our lives, our bodies, our minds. Daily practice, and I'm not perfect with this. I'm not pretending to be, but it typically consists of getting up with a high intensity workout in the morning, warming up and cooling down with yoga, dropping into even a short breathwork sequence right afterwards. And then transitioning into some type of spiritual reading, again, even if it's only for a couple minutes.
How long just out of curiosity, some details, like do you get up at 5 and do this? Does it last 10 minutes? Does it last an hour? Like what are some of the mechanics? Usually
the only way that I've been able to truly protect that time is by getting up around 5 and I'm typically in the gym by 6. Any later than that, I found it difficult to really maintain or too easy to get distracted, right?
Yep.
So I think in the morning that's been really valuable. Obviously, throughout the day, I'm maintaining a hormonally balanced diet.
One more question about the morning. Do you do all that on your own? Do you take classes? Is this something, because at first I was picturing you doing this when you woke up like in your living room or at home, but you go to the gym. So how do you incorporate the yoga and then the high intensity and then the spiritual practice? Is that all done at the gym?
Yeah, I actually, so this little gym, I live in downtown San Jose, and there's this little gym that kind of has a side room if you buy the highest membership. And it's this cool little side room that basically has all gear needed to do any type of CrossFit workout or interval training or whatever.
Yep.
Bumper plates, the whole bit. And usually at that time in the morning, I'm the only one in there. So I love it, man. I'm in there solo. The workout itself is with the integration of the yoga is typically an hour and a half tops.
Yep.
And then I usually carry some type of spiritual type book with me.
Oh, cool.
I think what's in my bag right now is Marcus Aurelius Meditations.
Yep.
and I'll just, before I even leave the gym, I'll just sit there after doing breath work and just read through a couple, maybe a chapter of that book.
Yep.
Before leaving. And
cool.
And that, like, the most important facet of this practice is it's as you well know, right? It sets you up to own the day, to
totally.
control
Right.
the day.
Yep.
Right.
Win the morning, win the day. Totally. I fully buy into that.
Yep. And I always tell people too, like, I started smaller with this, and as I get, I have worked with people who, they'll almost get intimidated by the sound of, an hour and a half every morning, or I haven't worked out in 10 or 20 years. So I'm like, look, let's start as small as possible. Can you wake up and do 10 push-ups consistently?
Yep.
And maybe eat a little bit of a healthier breakfast? Can you walk around the block once really fast?
Right.
Or practice, and it's like, it kind of goes into how I really learned to integrate breath work into my life.
Mm-hmm.
For years, man, I had people telling me, like, yeah, just lay in bed in the morning and take 20 breaths before you get out of bed, and you'll see why it works. And I was like too anxious. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get through like 2 breaths, and I want to jump out of bed. So I kind of met him in the middle. And what I started to do was breath work while I was working out. Cool. I started with just 1 conscious breath a day, and that felt good. So I naturally moved to 2, and then that turned to 4. And now I integrate breath work into everything just naturally. My heart coherence it's pretty much perfect. I even do it on stage when I'm giving talks and everything. So
I love how you were willing to experiment and explore and find your own path that was appropriate for you, rather than listening to dogma or someone else trying to tell you. We do that a lot in the Whole Life Challenge. Is we tell people, look, these are ideas, but you've got to be an explorer. You can't just. It's funny. I heard the other day put the difference between exploration and researching. You can research all you want. Research is the guy on the sidelines who's reading about how to do it, and you can just get completely caught up in how do you do breath work, and you could probably go down 18 wormholes in how to do it, and never do it.
Right.
And I think the credit belongs to the people who are willing to just start. If you can walk around the block, walk around the block. It's great.
I love that, man. I mean, that how you describe that in terms of exploring is like, that alone is giving people permission.
Yeah, you might screw it up 18 times, but that's okay. You'll find your way. You keep going. You'll find your way.
Your practice is yours, right? And it's as small as it may seem. It's not small to you. It's
right. Yeah, I mean, when you first told me what you did, I was intimidated, actually. I mean, and I've been doing this stuff for 25 years. I'm like, geez, he gets up at 5 and then high and 10. I'm like, I started judging myself, actually. I don't do that. I'm not from a real negative place, but I can look back and go, the thoughts going through my head were, wow, that's impressive. That's really cool that you're able to. And it's just not what it had nothing to do with. I just fall into the trap. We're all human. Like, I think everybody kind of has that kind of a response. Like, somebody hears that I meditate in the morning or do journaling, and they're like, oh God, wow, that's pretty good. He's got a, it's the same thing. We all do it. So what are some of your other, you were about to say, and then I forced you to go back and give me more details of your morning. What are some of the other things you do to keep yourself sharp?
Well, one thing that I have just come to believe in so much is the power of reading. The power of constantly striving to learn more. And I'm in grad school right now studying consciousness. Very interesting degree that's happening there. That's just opening up my mind in so many different ways. And it's interesting, when things really get intense with that, I've almost been able to apply the same intensity to academic study as I do interval training or working out. I found that, just droning out and trying to read really dense literature all day long for 8-10 hours, whatever it is, was counterproductive. And I realized I was just zoning out too much. Or getting mentally fatigued. So I started breaking that down into how about I do 30 to 45 minute intervals of intensity and then take like a 15-minute break, and then hit that. And I became much more productive like that.
Cool. I mean, you are a pretty, I would say that your past, given that you studied Arabic and the level of knowledge that you possess even before you're now studying more stuff is pretty impressive. So, it's good to hear that you even have to work at that. And some people would say that you have a level of mastery that they'll never get to. But I hear what you're saying is even at that level of mastery, you have to come up with ways for you to continue. It doesn't necessarily come easy.
Excuse me, never. I actually I kind of feel that I'm always going to need to be in grad school of some kind.
Yeah, right.
It's like the more you learn, the less you understand. There's an endless array of information out there in a world of increasing specialization, increasing complexity. And our only way to really integrate all of this information together is to dedicate ourselves to seeking to learn, right? Mm-hmm. Because all of this together, it enhances our ability to create, right? And creativity ultimately is the inverse of trauma and adversity. The reason being, traumatic experiences, adverse experiences, if we're unable to process them and integrate them, they leave us trapped in the past.
Right.
And we mentally, physically, and we're kind of left trying to operate in today with our prior constructs.
Yep.
Right. What allows us to dislodge that? Asymmetrically dislodge that thought process, those emotional processes. It's creativity, it's innovation, right? So if we can disrupt the way we think about the past and constantly be on this razor's edge of learning, staying adaptive, that fosters creativity and innovation, right? Which is the true beauty of life.
That's cool. I love the way you put that. At first I was having trouble conceptualizing what you meant, but then as soon as you said, being trapped in the past, creativity can't happen with the confines of the past and the judgments that come along with the past. Creativity doesn't work so well when you're judging. So yeah.
So that's why I think academic study is so important. Reading is so important. Those perspectives can dislodge us. Different activities. Music. Playing a musical instrument, cooking, whatever it is that is your passion. That diversity that you can bring to life and sort of step out of your comfort zone can be extremely healthy and in fostering continuous transformation and growth.
Now, do you still continue to work on the shame and the guilt and the things that you've learned about yourself over the last 10 years? Do you work with a therapist? Do you have a practice around that keeps that stuff from rematerializing perhaps?
Yeah. Like everything, it's I feel like I'm learning more every day and always will be. And when it comes to the guilt and shame stuff, I feel like I'm just getting started, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It's like, when I dig up old research studies and I'm finding different ways to apply it to the present day, not just for me, but for the work that I do in general. And I feel like there's such a vast amount of information out there that's still kind of siloed, right? That the effort to integrate all of these things together and become the bridge between all of them is what excites me the most, in terms of self growth and facilitating the growth of others as well.
So you continue to practice, obviously, because you have to. You're learning. You're in school. Are there any other practices you do to keep that personal?
Not really specifically. I mean, it's more being open, constantly open to it, right? Mm-hmm. Like every time I set foot on stage, I'm always learning more.
Right. I
love Q&A. Even this discussion we're having right here, there's different lenses through the questions you're asking, right? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of pushing me into new thoughts and new processes.
Right.
Every time I read something or read about a new therapeutic modality or a research study, I'm open to kind of applying and molding and shaping the way that I think about things, right? While maintaining that foundation. So it's a constant, endless interplay that is kind of that practice, if you will.
Right. Got
it. It's infused in every part of my life is the best way that I can say that,
That's cool. Well, look, I could probably go on asking questions for another hour and a half, and that would monopolize both my time, your time, and probably would get me less listeners. Because I don't know if anybody wants to, wade through that long of a podcast. But I want to ask you, just in conclusion, what sorts of things now, or what would you like to leave people with? Like, you've got an opportunity. Let's just say this is your last opportunity to communicate something that you want to leave a mark on the world with. What do you tell people?
Remember that trauma is relative. It doesn't discriminate, and it's not always what it seems. There's a world-renowned psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor named Viktor Frankl, who said in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. And that the suffering we endure gives us ample opportunity to derive greater meaning in our lives. So while suffering is universal, transformation is not. That's up to each one of us, right? And, as difficult and courageous as that journey is, it's not a journey that we need to take alone, right? That the power of human connection is surrounding you. It was and is everywhere. And, there's a phrase that I picked up from a therapist that I was working with one time after a group therapy session, who turned to me and said, Josh, I really believe the role of a therapist is to help people suffer productively as opposed to allowing them to suffer in vain.
Oh, that's cool. I like that.
And we're never going to find a more grounded definition of what therapy is, of what expert companionship is, the relationships between us are than this.
Yep.
So, be willing to look at yourself through a new lens if any of this hits you, and spark conversations. Take this conversation farther. Take it between your friends, your family members, where it's appropriate. And getting these things out into the open and into the surface is oftentimes our greatest weapon in being able to overcome it.
Josh, how do people find you?
darkersouls.com.
Social media, are you?
I'm also on all the social media links are on there.
Great.
They're all live. So the Facebook page is Darker Souls LLC.
Okay. And your book is called Darker Souls. What's the tag? What's the?
Yep. The title of the book is The Beauty of a Darker Soul.
That's right.
So that's on Amazon, and it's also listed on the website if you want a signed copy.
Cool.
So.
Well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate you being here with us and sharing your story. It's really, it's like I said, it's as moving now as it was when you told it in person, and I really appreciate your message beyond what happened after the near-death experience. Is really you're having a tremendous impact, and thank you.
Likewise, Andy. Thank you so much, and this was a pleasure.
Hey, it's Andy, and thanks so much for listening. If you want to know more about what I'm learning each month, head over to andypetronic.com and subscribe to my monthly newsletter. If you were touched, moved, or inspired by anything you heard today, chances are someone else you know would be too. please take a moment to think about who and send them a link to this episode. And if you're super stoked, please head over to iTunes to write a review. The best way to keep current on guests and episodes is to subscribe so that the latest one will automatically get delivered straight to your phone. The apps I used for this are Apple Podcasts, Overcast, or Pocket Casts. The Andy Petronic podcast is produced by our team, Winslow Jenkins, Becca Borowski, and Ernie Hurtado. Big thanks to Nikki Grudidaria for the artwork. You can find all of our episodes, links, and complete show notes at wholelifechallenge.com/podcast. I'm Andy Petronic. Thanks for listening.